Hello everyone, I'm Kate Steinbeck, welcoming you to our webinar for the month of April on behalf of the Wellbeing, Youth and Health NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence. I just again acknowledge our funders, the NHMRC, and all the universities that are involved in our research program. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia, wherever those who are listening to us are, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also want to remind everyone who listens that you are part of a community of practice. That is a place where researchers, clinicians, policymakers and young people can come together to particularly look at the important topics that we need to be researching as a Centre of Research Excellence. And there'll be more on that coming out on our website this year. There'll be invitations to become part of our community quite formally. And I always have to have some housekeeping to remind you that your microphone will be muted and your video switched off. So you don't have to worry about that we do that. If you have something that you want to say or you want to ask a question, all of that goes in the chat panel. And I can see that people are starting to come on and say hi. You can, of course, say hi and say where you're from and say hello to people who might have been on previous webinars, but we'll answer questions at the end of the webinar. That seems to work the best, and you type your comment in at the bottom of the chat panel, pretty similar to Zoom. And so without further ado, I would love to introduce Kate Munro, who's with us today, and she's speaking as the CEO at Youth Action, which many of you I'm sure will have heard of, which is the peak body that represents young people and, importantly, the services that support them in New South Wales. But Kate is now at Youth Action, but she has a very long CV of about 30 years experience in youth and community service sector, and really keen on what we're keen on, which is youth participation, child and human rights, youth development, and a really advocacy for young people who are often missed out from our point of view in the healthcare space. And that's also in many other parts of the community, that young people need to be part of the action, and I think Youth Action is named very appropriately. So Kate, without more ado, welcome.
Thank you. You can hear me all right? Excellent. So look, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands that we're meeting on today. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people in Sydney, in Woolloomooloo, where our office is. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people on this call. And also, again, similar to Kate's message, I'd like to recognise over 60,000 years of connection to land, language, water and culture on this land that was never ceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So thank you so much for having me. This is another of those weird experiences where I have no idea who's on the call. So if it's people that I know, it's awesome. I'm really excited that maybe I know you. If I don't know you, I'm really excited to meet you. I'm going to, as Kate said, I'll go through this presentation and take questions at the end. But I have a lot of learning in this space. I'm by no means, I'm sure that you're all expert in this space as well. So I'm not kind of putting myself up as having any kind of privileged knowledge. I'm really interested to hear about how you're doing things in your worlds. If this is relevant to you, that's fantastic. If there's learning or thoughts or ideas or great things that you're doing, love you to share them in the chat, because the more I learn as well, every time I do these things, I learn more stuff. So first off, for those who don't know, and apologies for those who do know us, but I just thought I'd give you a little bit of an overview about Youth Action. So we're the peak body that represents young people and the services who support them in New South Wales. So our vision is a society where all New South Wales young people are supported, engaged, values, and have their rights realised. Our work sits in that kind of nexus of capacity building for young people and youth workers and youth services, and then also that advocacy space, advocating for systemic change and for policy change on issues that affect those groups. And then as a peak, just again, it's just just to give you a bit of an idea. So we have about 150 organisational members. We also have individual memberships for both young people and for workers working with young people. So if you like what we do, love you to have a look on our website and sign up as a member, or even just sign up for our newsletter, because that's where we offer a lot of opportunities in that space. So we'd love you to engage more with the work that we do. Sector development. So we do a lot of professional development work for professional training for the sector in a whole range of different things. But I guess predominantly, our core business is participation, youth voice, sector voice, policy and advocacy. So that's where a lot of our training is. But we also partner with other training providers to do different things at different times. So we've done things around youth development. We've offered training around cultural competency training or cultural safety training. So that throughout the year, there's a range of different things that happen. And then obviously voice is hugely important for us, in particular voice of young people and policy development. So that's I guess our core areas of work. And I just wanted to put this slide up as well to give you a bit of a sense about there are some very core principles to the work that we do. So we always give a particular focus to those socially excluded groups, so regional young people, First Nations young people, LGBTQIA+ young people with disability, those from culturally and linguistically diverse communities, including migrants and refugees, and young people doing it tough. So we want to make sure that whilst we represent the full diversity of young people in New South Wales, we're very aware that there are particular groups whose voices get, can be drowned out by some of those more mainstream voices. So we give a particular focus to those groups. We are a rights-based organisation. So as I said in our vision, it is about supporting young people to have their rights realised. So we use that rights-based lens to focus on programs, policy and advocacy. And obviously that's in relation to those meaningful outcomes. It's evidence-based, and we make sure that it's strengths-based and informed by data and evidence. And then the other one that I think is really important for us, and we are very intentional about this last statement, again, as a peak in the sector, is that we strive to be, we are always learning to be a good, an ally to self-determination of First Nations communities. We think it's incredibly important that work with First Nations people is led by Aboriginal owned and controlled organisations, that First Nations young people have access to that support from people within their own communities. Obviously, the expertise of young people, young people's voice, we believe that young people possess all of the knowledge and skills and thoughts that they need to come up with solutions to address the issues that they face. So that lived expertise is a hugely important part of the principle that underpins the work that we do. Again, the expertise of the sector. So everything we do is guided by the voice of young people in sector. And then, again, to be a trustworthy partner and a collaborator. So a lot of our work is done collaboratively. We're a small organisation. We have about 9 staff at the moment, so we're fairly small. So we're always looking at opportunities to partner with people to do, that kind of policy participation advocacy work. Nice picture about. We just launched our strategic plan, so we launched that last year, and I just thought I'd give you, again, it's just because I'm talking to you about young people and that co-design in a policy space. I just wanted to give you a bit of a sense about what are the policy priorities that we have over the next 3 years. So we've got a key initiative which runs across the life of our plan. And this came up, so it's about youth justice through care. And this came out of our consultations with young people and the sector about the issue of for us, we've got a very broad definition of through care. So what are the supports and services that young people in contact with the law and justice systems need prior to coming into that contact, to keep them out of the law and justice systems? If they're in those systems, what kind of supports and services they need whilst they navigate that system, and including in custody, and then what happens to reintegrate young people into community. And the reason we chose that initiative, which came out of our consultations for our plan, so we did a lot of consultations with the sector, with young people, with our key stakeholders, with government to come up with these priorities. But what came up with the True Care one is much of that work that happens in that True Care space happens in the youth sector. It happens in local youth services. It happens on the ground in community. And as the peak that represents young people and the services that support them, we thought that was a really important area for us to be doing work in, because it gives us an opportunity to shine a spotlight on the really vital work that's happening in those areas. And then we have 3 other key primary policy and advocacy areas. So one is health and wellbeing, one is education and learning, and one is jobs and income. And then what we also have, which isn't on that slide, but we have, so those 3 areas we will lead in. We have 4 other areas where we're not going to lead, but we will partner with people on, because we recognise, again, what we heard from young people are these are issues that are really important to them. So one of the secondary areas is civics engagement. So that's the whole kind of range of things about how do young people get actively involved in their communities, democracy, how are young people involved in democratic processes. The second one is sector issues, so very specifically youth sector issues that things around funding initiatives. We're not an industry body, so we don't represent the sector. We represent the sector in their capacity to support young people. But, as funding programs change, as particular issues come up for the sector that are challenges in how they provide their job, how they do their work with young people, we'll take those up. Budgets and elections, so both young people and the sector are really interested in what happens in how investment gets allocated through budgets, what do election processes look like. We'll start to do a bit more election work. We'll do a little bit for the federal election, but definitely for the state election, we'll have a number of priorities that we'll be putting to, those different parties that are running in the election. And then the last one, it's a bit of a catch-all, but it's really important for young people, is we've named it intergenerational issues, and it's that idea about things like climate change, things like housing affordability, cost of living, tax reform, all of those things that they impact multiple generations, but young people are disproportionately impacted by, or negatively disproportionately impacted. So we want to make sure we recognise those things as well. So young people, so co-designing policy with young people. And again, I want to recognise, without knowing who's on the call, except for I've seen a few people whose names I recognise who could, do this stuff way better than I do. So I want to kind of recognise that I want a shout out to people who are already doing amazing work in this space. But I think for us, I guess I'm just going to talk about what we do at Youth Action and the learning we have, and then I'm hoping that that's helpful for people who maybe are on a bit of a journey in this space, or alternatively, it'll generate some questions at the end. But obviously for us, young people's voices are incredibly important to include. Why? Because it's really obvious. Policy is better when the people, and again, you all know this, it's not, I think if I can get anything across to you, you already know this, it's really easy. Sometimes people feel like getting young people, bringing young people into this space and bringing young people particularly into a policy space, people feel anxious about that, but young people aren't interested. What do we do? It's going to be really hard. It's really not, and young people are super interested. So it's just about getting it. Just do it. Just get into it. So obviously, policy is better when it's designed by the people who it's going to be most impacted about. It's young people's right, and we're really strong on that. We spend a lot of time talking to young people about that, as I imagine many of you do, but it's actually their right to be included. So it's a non-negotiable for us. It's not wouldn't it be nice to do that? Wouldn't it be, that'll be the last thing we do in the process, is just find out what young people think. It's the place that we start from. And then the other point is, obviously, as I mentioned before, young people are experts in their own lives, and they've got all of these answers and they've got all these solutions based on that lived expertise. And so it's, it's crucial that we do that stuff. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I guess we've named it, and it's probably other people, but I don't know if I can claim it, but we talk about strengths-based advocacy. And the reason that we decided to talk about it, and we're very intentional about naming the work that we do as strengths-based advocacy. And the reason we decided to do that is it became really clear during the pandemic. Young people were talking to us about how they just felt like they were being spoken about all the time. They were being spoken about as objects of policy. They were being spoken about in the media. Young people are bearing the brunt. Young people are the most impacted. Young people are having all these things going on that are, all these disproportionate impacts about COVID, which is really true. But what that meant is young people felt really overwhelmed. They felt really powerless, and they felt really left out of those discussions. And I'm sure anyone who works in a mental health space with young people knows that. Young people, any young people that you spoke to during those times just felt like they had no sense of agency in what was happening. They had no control over what was happening. School was unpredictable, work was unpredictable, home life was unpredictable. There was just this complete kind of lack of control, and then they were being spoken about. And I think that, understandable in times of, in that kind of immediate emergency response. But we think it's really important, now and obviously since the beginning of the pandemic, to try and shift the way we speak about young people, so that we do start to speak about them with a sense of agency. Again, anyone who works in the UC, anyone who works in the human services sector, we bleed strengths-based approaches to working with young people. We know it inside out, but strangely, when we came to policy and when we came to advocacy, we were still using that really deficit-focused language. Young people are problems that needed to be fixed. Young people are causing a problem. Somebody external needs to come in and fix that problem for those young people. And I think that's, as we can say, it doesn't surprise me that mental health is so has been so exacerbated by the experience for young people. Obviously, there is a range of individual circumstances, but I actually think systemically we took away young people's sense of control and having a sense of agency in this space. So we're very intentional about that. For us, that strengths-based advocacy is about bringing people into those discussions and using their lived expertise to co-design solutions to those really complex challenges. And it's a partnership process. We bring a knowledge and an understanding of systems and systemic change. Young people bring a lived expertise of solutions and possibilities. And I also thought, and I hope people are kind of human in here, let me just take you on a bit of a journey, and I'm really sorry if this is stuff that you already know. But one of the things I thought that might be useful in this talk is actually to talk a bit about the power of questions and the kinds of, because for us, this is where the process starts. And why the questions are really important is how we then create that sense of agency. So anyone who works in that in counselling or individual therapies already knows about the role of what an important role questions play. Questions are powerful. Questions create insight, and insight creates change. And in the same way that it creates change at an individual level, it creates change at a systemic level for people. And so I thought I'd like to talk a little bit about the kinds of questions that we use when we want to draw out those experiences from young people about what's happening in their lives and the changes that they want to see, and then how that builds that sense of agency for young people. And I'm hoping that this answers some of those questions for people about, is it hard? How do I do it? Where do I start with young people? Once I go through these questions, these are super simple questions. Anyone who works in an individual space is probably already asking them of the people that they work with. Some of the stuff that I've chosen to speak to you today is about comes from an appreciative inquiry approach. So again, I think there's probably people on this call who know about appreciative inquiry, but again, it's one of those strengths-based approaches. There's many other different ways. There's many other different approaches that do pretty much the same thing. And I'm just a heads up, I do have a slide about appreciative inquiry, but I've realised it's dropped further into this presentation. So I'm going to jump into the questions bit now, and then I'll talk you through a little bit of the history of appreciative inquiry next. But I thought I'd give you this slide first. Again, not telling you anything that you don't already know, but language is incredibly important. And adults talking to young people often, it's easy to forget that. It's easy, again, I spoke about it before, it's really easy to fall into talking about young people as objects. And when you talk about them as objects, they no longer have that sense of empowerment. Another one around language, again, that idea about problems versus challenges. And it's really simple shifts. And again, I think you're probably already doing it. But it is about that. How do we collaborate with young people? How do we create a space where young people want to work on something where they're not the problem? We're working together to address, to tackle a challenge. Again, there's a sense of energy. There's a sense of, change in that. It's not about it's your problem and somehow I'm going to come up with some great idea about how I should fix that. The other one, and I think super simple statements, really important in the way that for us in our policy work, because we want our policy to be solutions focused. We want young people to be on that journey of co-creating policy recommendations, co-creating policy, co-creating solutions with us. So that idea of questions create momentum. And if anyone's heard that statement around energy follows attention. So the questions we ask, actually, they drive us towards the outcomes that we want. And I really like that third box there that's about the more positive our question, the more it will create the possible. And we work very much in a space with young people about the possible. What is possible? What are good policy solutions? What are we drawing upon that already exists that can be replicated, that's already there in the community? And I think that for us, when we do our consultations with young people and when we involve young people in these processes, it's an opportunity for us to also we work really hard to make sure it's not just an extractive process. So it's not just us asking young people for input, but it's also about helping young people build insight. And for anyone who's worked in an individual change space or even a systemic change space, but that idea about having your voice heard should be empowering, and never underestimating that transformative power of having your voice heard. So not only do we gain something out of this experience and we get better policy and we work on that with young people, but young people are different as a result of that experience. Young people have a different insight. Young people have a different sense of agency. They have a different sense of, what change they can make. And they can go on and do that in their own spaces. So it kind of lives on outside their interaction with us. Again, this is more just looking at that deficit, where we sit in that deficit space. And so much of our, and particularly when you think about this in the context of the pandemic, so much of our policy and our practice has gone back into that kind of doing for people because it was an emergency. People needed to have things, they needed services, we needed policies, we needed lots of things created fast, and a lot of things got done for us. But I think that the danger is that we now we probably needed to do it about 12 months ago. It's happening, but it's taking control back again. So appreciative inquiry sits in that space of, again, strengths-based. So not looking at what's wrong, but looking at what's strong. How do we build more of what's strong? Not looking at problems, but looking at possibilities. What are the possibilities created by once we start looking at what's strong and what's working? Once we start looking at what we want to see more of, which kind of is in that space of what's not working, then what are the possibilities? What are the things that we can move towards? So for those, this is a quick appreciative inquiry 101. And I realised that there was a typo, and the slide before should have had inquiry with an I. I made these slides the other day when I was really tired, so I'm so sorry. Again, it's that shift from problem solving. So appreciative inquiry is a collaborative process. It's looking at how we work together to find those things that exist within our communities. And I would say that young people, and again, I don't think I'm telling you anything that you don't know, but young people are one of the biggest untapped resources that we have in our communities. There's so much that young people have to offer. There's so much that young people are passionate about and excited about, or just have their own lived expertise that they want to contribute to make things different for young people in circumstances like this. So I think once we start to see young people as those assets and those resources, then everything you do changes. The way you look at how you whether you're, if you're in a systems change space, if you're in a policy space, once you start to look at young people differently, the whole way that you look at what you do in your work will change as well. And this is just my quick, so if anyone, again, it's got another typo on it, I'm so sorry. So appreciative inquiry sits in those strengths-based approaches. It started in the 80s, but it was very much about, it's got that aspect of generative change. So looking at the best of what is, which helps realise the ideal of what might be with the consent of what should be for the reality of what can be. So it's, again, there's a real, there's a kind of dynamic energy about it. It doesn't matter what, I guess it doesn't matter, even in the middle of a pandemic, we did work with young people around voices in policy, and we use this form of questioning. And it's empowering, even in the worst of circumstances, and, again, really mirrors those individual approaches with people. But even when people are experiencing in a trauma space, even when things are really tough, this is the bit, that piece, again, never underestimate the transformative power of having your voice heard. This is the bit that makes people feel like at least there is a role that they have to play in making things different. They are important. Even their tough and challenging experiences are incredibly important to creating solutions about how things can be different. I guess I just wanted to, I know I've talked a bit about it, but I wanted to, I guess, go back again to that thing about in a policy space, and we don't think about this as much, in that space where you're collecting questions, whether it's research, whether it's forums, whether it's surveys, whatever space you work in to gather that data. I think that idea about making sure it's not just extractive. So what are we wanting young people to think about differently? So we spend a lot of time I will talk about some of the questions that we ask, and they're pretty simple. But even when we go to kind of more complex questions, we spend a lot of time sort of testing them to see, if I'm asking that question, what is the person who's answering that going to feel like? What will that get me the answer I want, that gives me that sense of what's possible? And it's not as easy as it sounds. But I think also that bit about what are young people, what's the insight that they take away from that? And then I think there's that thing about, and again, it was really obvious in a policy and advocacy space. And again, I suspect I spend a little bit of my time in a health space, not as much as I have in previous jobs, but I would hazard a guess that in the health space, young people are talked about all the time as problems to be fixed. I think that I would hazard that the questions that happen in a health space that young people get asked are often questions that make them feel overwhelmed and make them feel hopeless and make them feel powerless. It's not intentional, but it's, having something wrong with you, having a condition, it's very, having a label, all of those things. I think young people feel that incredibly strongly. So there's a lot of space to look at actually how do we shift those questions that actually make young people feel like they are part of my learning as a professional. So every time I sit in front of a group of young people, I learn something different. So that lived expertise and what is the value of that? And then also, how does that lived expertise then inform the work that we do? And I think that the young people that you speak to that are the more socially excluded those young people, the more powerful this experience is for them, because they're so used to feeling like their experiences aren't validated, that their experiences are problems that they created. So to actually use this questioning process with them is it's incredibly transformative, so give it a go, definitely. And the last one I wanted to talk about in terms of questions is, before I tell you a little bit about some of the things how we put this into practice at Youth Action, but I think there's this, and again, I keep going back to the people who are doing individual work, but it's a mirror of that. The flow is really important. So it's about taking people on a journey. So there's that initial question that's a reflective question about, and for us, it's usually a question it's as simple as what's working for young people in whatever the topic is. If we were doing something about health service, we'd be like, what's working well for young people in health services? And then our second question would be, what's not working so well? And it's really important we give very broad questions to allow young people to determine what that, there's no preconceived agenda. So we don't ask young people about, tell us about mental health issues, tell us about, medical issues, tell us about, it's not that. We don't preconceive those categories. We look at a follow-on question, which is about, and the what's working well is really important. It's really important you do it first, because it's the one, again, in a counselling space, it's the same thing. You want to find out what are the things that you can draw on. What are those strengths? What are those things that are working that can be drawn out, replicated? The what's not working so well is a really important question to validate that things, there are problems, there are issues. It's not, this process is not rose-tinted glasses, but it is about giving people space to name the things that are tough. But every time it happens for me, and every time I wonder if the process will fail me, and it doesn't, but I always have a moment where I worry. But if you ask them in that order, then the third question is that future-focused question. So it is that question that's about, what would you like to see more of? What would you like to see? What's the change that you want to see happen? What are the priorities that you want on this? If it's a policy question, we'll often ask, what are the priorities that you think policymakers or decision makers should make in relation to young people? We might ask, what are the supports and services that young people need? But if you've asked those first two questions in that order, the flow takes them into that space of possibilities, and you get these amazingly rich answers that, are the solution. So it's actually really easy and simple. It's not there's a skill, so it's not that there's a real skill in being quiet. There's a real skill in not leading young people. Again, same as a counselling space. It's not about me telling young people what I think, and it's very easy to fall down that rabbit hole, telling young people or pushing them towards the answers that I think. But when you get it right, that flow is beautiful, and you walk out of that group with young people, go, oh, that was amazing. People should do more of this. And it's crazy because I only asked 3 really simple questions and I just listened. And it's such the simplicity of it is its beauty, but the feeling that young people have is, I got to be in a space where I could just speak my truth and my reality and share my ideas about what I thought was really important. And we'll do this in, we do these in anywhere between, it can be 2 or 3 young people up to, I was in Munro last week and it was a group of 200 young people that we did this with, and it works in large or small groups. And then what you kind of pull out of that, for us, what we pull out of that in a policy space is we pull together a whole lot of themes about what young people told us. Again, no different to what others of you that are working in this area are doing. But we pull that together, and we'll usually pull together some recommendations as well. So it's a start. Like, this isn't I think sometimes it's really interesting when I have conversations with government or with people who've asked us to come and do this work for them with their young people. They find it too simple, and they're like, no, but we really need to know this. So can you ask them about this? Can you do more on that? And I often just say that, just trust me, that will come out. If that's an issue for young people, that will come out. And it always does. Invariably, if someone tells me that there's a problem going on in a particular area, if I ask those 3 questions, young people will talk about that, but they'll talk about it in their own way, in their own time. And it will give you the opportunity to kind of go, well, what are the most important themes for young people? And this is not the in-depth bit, this is just the beginning. This is the beginning of thinking about, well, what are the themes? What are the things that we want to look into more? What would be the things that we might want to co-design with young people? What actions might we co-design from this process? But this is such a beautiful, simple starting place. So I thought I would give you, these are some lovely young people that work on our projects. So yeah, I said this earlier before, is the right to be included. It leads to better policy and project and policy outcomes, and it's way easier than what you think. But what I thought I would do is give you a little bit of I'll just tell you a little bit about because this is a health conversation, I'll tell you a little bit about our Us for Health project and how we did some co-design processes with young people, or how we co-designed that what happens in that program with young people. And then I'll also give you just a little bit of background on a couple of the other the youth participation pieces that we're doing at the moment around policy and advocacy and how we're involving young people in that. So our Us for Health project is It's a project that we have funded through Ministry of Health. Thank you very much. Shout out to anyone from Ministry of Health on this call. And it's based on research, which again, many of you were probably part of. The research from Alliance of New South Wales Universities called the Access Studies, and it's about how do we improve. It's about, and I say this out loud, and then I have to always add a caveat to it. So it's about improving young people's literacy around health services. I would actually say that it's the health services needs to improve their literacy about young people, about humans. So it's not, again, it's talking about deficit language and the way we frame things. I think young people's health literacy isn't the problem. I use this example. My mum was still alive, just doesn't work in the health system anymore, but was a professor of microbiology. She supported my stepfather through really serious, some really serious health issues that he had in the health system. And my mum couldn't get the services that she did. It was a really tough process. So if my mum, who's a professor of microbiology, struggles, how on earth could I ever hope to teach young people about health literacy? So I'm very aware that what we're doing is the language around it could probably be better, but it's a fantastic process. So what we've been doing, enough about that, enough about my mum's struggles accessing health services. And I'm sure any of you that have had to deal with the health system in your own personal lives, something, how is this so complicated? Like, I don't know how people ever manage this. So we have a subversive angle about how do we teach the health system to be more young person literate. But what the Ask for Health project looked at is, one component was developing a website. It's a nice little image of what our website looks like. But a website is it's a tool. It's only as good as people's capacity to use it. So it doesn't increase people's health literacy. We've written this in more. We co-designed this with young people. We've had young people working on the content throughout. We've had a number of really amazing health professionals working on the content. So it's as good as we can get, I think, in terms of just accessibility from a kind of understanding and a visual perspective. But the other part of that project, which I think is really important and sits in this youth policy and advocacy space, is we're also we had a youth health our health literacy advisory council. So we had 12 young people from across New South Wales, and we selected them. We put out an EOI for those 12. We got 75 responses to that EOI. So anyone who thinks young people aren't interested in health, I beg to differ. That group worked on, and they did 12 months of work for us, working on all of the different elements of that project. So the project planning, we went through the theory of change with them. We taught them evaluation. We contracted a really great person who works in the space around outcomes measurement and got her to do some training with that group. They did a whole lot of work around the communications and how we want to communicate the content of this. And then we have a peer program, which is, we're just moving into that phase now. But that will be about, and the Health Literacy Advisory Council were part of it, but that's about, we're going to do peer-to-peer content training. So they developed the content for it. We're going to do training with the sector, so with youth workers and people who, again, to help them navigate that space and to kind of capacity build them, and then also peer-to-peer training with young people. So it's that co-design process from from woe to go in terms of how do you bring young people into a project. Wasn't quite from the beginning, but was certainly from when I started at Youth Action. So we'll have 2 years of that really embedded participation framework. And it's been I think the other piece to remember about co-design, and for anyone who does it, you know this, it takes longer. It takes resourcing. So we have a coordinator on that project, but a lot of her time was spent supporting the HALAC, the Health Literacy Advisory Council. So it takes resourcing and it takes time. We probably could have knocked up most of that stuff in maybe 3 to 4 months if we were just doing it as workers. We stretched it for 12 months to really bring young people on that journey of learning. What we got out of 12 months is exponentially better than what we would have got if we just did it ourselves in 4 months. So it's a really good reminder. So I think that's the health one. And I've got 5 minutes, so I would like to just talk about a little bit we've got 2 other big parts of our big parts of our policy and advocacy work that relate to our strategic plan, that we're also on that journey with young people around voice. So we did a piece of research, or we contracted the Australia Institute to do a piece of research with us about youth employment and young people's experience of youth employment. And so rather than just contracting them and then they do, this amazing policy piece with all of their fantastic policy skill, and they're amazing economists who pull up all of these numbers and graphs. We also, alongside that, we did a series of consultations with young people about their lived experience of employment. We then we gave those to the Australia Council to put into their report. They came up with a series of recommendations. We then brought together a roundtable of, I think we had about 20 young people came to that roundtable, and we tested those recommendations with young people. So do these recommendations sound right to you? Do they sound like they, what would make them workable? Do they apply to the diversity of young people? And so both the HALAC and the young people at that roundtable, we strive very hard to make sure that they were a really diverse representation. Again, as I said at the beginning, those socially excluded groups are really important to us. And so we want to make sure that we don't just get the kind of usual suspects in the work that we do, which again means putting in extra support. Some of those young people, it's their very first time doing things like this. Other of those young people on those committees have more experience in that space than I do. So we tested those recommendations with young people. We then also brought together another roundtable with government representatives, sector representatives, and a group of representatives of young people from that roundtable. Tested it again to make sure that that we weren't missing anything that was happening in a government or a sector space, but also gave young people the opportunity to speak to their reality and their lived expertise. And that report, we will be launching that report. Fingers crossed it will be in the next couple of weeks. We're hoping to do it maybe by Youth Week if we can. We're just getting our launch kind of stuff sorted out, but we'll be sharing that report. So again, really, I'd love you to have a look at it. I'm really interested in people's feedback when they say it about just how that voice piece sits in that. And then we have another piece of policy and advocacy that we're doing about our through care. And for that one, it's a little bit different. We're really mindful that young people in that law and justice system, it's such a complex, it's a really complex, difficult, overwhelming system. It's a complex, difficult, overwhelming system for workers. So for young people, even more so. So we're looking at how do we bring young people's voices in a way that's safe. There's a lot of, and I've done it in the past as well, and it's been my learning through that. There's a lot of people who bring young people into, come and meet a decision maker. They've got their advocates group, or they've got a young ambassador, or people with lived experience. And particularly for people, it's probably the same for people in a mental health space. Young people who have had a really, I don't want to say in-depth experience, but young people who really have been part of that system to the point perhaps where they're almost in that kind of institutionalized space. There's so much, the power of putting them in front of a decision maker is so, it creates such a sense of expectation. There's that moment of, I feel really validated. I got to speak to the minister. I got to speak to, a really high level bureaucrat. They listened to me. They nodded. They took everything, they lapped up everything I was saying, and then nothing changes. And we've all been part of that. We've all been part of those kinds of meetings. So I'm really mindful about not taking young people into that space, because I just think it's heartbreaking. And I know young people who've sat on the other side of that, just gone, I've spoken to so many ministers and nothing changes. So what we're doing for that project is we've got some funding to work with the Australian Theatre for Young People, and we're actually going to do a series of consultations and then look at developing a script from those consultations and some further workshops with young people who have that lived expertise to develop a script that is a series of vignettes of their collective stories. So it's no single person story. We're not asking any young person to get up and share their story, but it will be a series of vignettes. It's a collective story. And then from that story, that script will be performed by a group of actors. So it's kind of almost like that thing where people say, I saw that movie or that show and that was my life. And, there's this actor playing your best self. They're doing a much better job of being you than you would if you were up on a stage. We don't have the funding to tour that production, but we're going to get it up to the stage where we can do a reading with professional actors, and then we're hoping to then find some further funding, or A2IP will find some further funding to hopefully tour it, but at the very least we'll be able to get that in front of some influential people with that intention of drawing attention to the work that needs to be done in terms of supporting young people in that law and justice space. And I have no doubt that when we put their collective stories together, the answers will they're so clear. I mean, it's always about early intervention. It's always about more supporting community. It's always about, consistent support. So it's just a different way of bringing young people's voices into a policy space. So I think I am 1 minute over my time, and I have some time for questions. So I'm going to shut my slides down, and I think Kate, you're going to help me, are you? You're going to tell me what questions you want me to answer, or not? Have I lost Kate? I'm assuming I'm still on and people can still hear me. I've got that really awkward Zoom moment where I can only see myself. Maybe someone can type in the chat. Can you still hear me? I'm still there. Kate, send me technical. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I can see a question which Kate posted, which said, you've been to Munro recently. Are there any light bulb moments that you could share, or perhaps other examples of light bulb moments? Look, I think that the biggest light bulb moment for me, and it's always my light bulb moment, but it was really clear in an area like Moree, and there are many areas in New South Wales that are like that, where there's a lot of services and there's a lot of focus, and government's got its finger in there, and multiple government agencies and multiple NGOs, is young people's voice is missing. So people are not including young people's voices in it. People are in there designing things for young people, and young people are sitting back as these passive recipients of programs and activities and services, going, I kind of like that, that's all right, don't like that, that's not so good. But they don't feel like they have any more say in actually, if I don't like it, how do I change it? Or if I do like it and want to see more of it, how do I make that happen? So it's really clear to me that just young people's voices, and it's not funded. I mean, that's the difficult thing, right? There's not funding. There are small grants around. So the Youth Opportunities Program that Department of Communities and Justice offers is very specifically about youth participation. There are grants that give a nod to including young people's voices, but it's not given the resourcing that it needs. Like I said, for our HALAC, we pay all of our young people on our HALAC. I think young people involved in any of these processes, if they're doing work for you, they should be paid. If they're doing work for another organisation, they should be paid. So it's I think in that space, it's how do we resource young people's voices, and then two, how do we make sure we're including them?
Thank you, Kate. I realised I was off the screen for a little while. It looks as though you've had to take over as host.
Only your question. I only answered your question.
Thank you for starting the first question. And I should say that while we're answering questions, there have been so many appreciative comments about appreciative inquiry. And it's lovely to actually see a framework of what you probably do, what many of us do, but to somehow make it simpler and easier for us to achieve what we really want to achieve for young people. And there is just a comment from Pamela about the payment. I mean, I couldn't agree more about the lack of understanding about payment for young people who take part. And it certainly came across when I was looking at some university teaching, and the university says there's absolutely nothing that we can put in to assist young people to come and spending maybe half a day and doing a teaching program. Yeah. So we have a lot of work to do to just make people think that it's not good enough to invite them. An invitation is not remuneration.
No, and when I get invited to things, I do it on work time, and I'm paid to do that.
It's true.
I mean, I think there's a lot. So we don't pay young people for when we do submissions. So if we're doing a submission, or if we're doing just a broad consultation about, improving some kind of policy for young people, we don't pay for those. And the rationale for that is, It's their right to have their democratic, that's their democratic right to have their voice included in policy decisions. And the last thing we would want to do is not be able to only be able to listen to a certain number of young people because funding prevented us from being able to pay more. And I also don't want to set up a false, not an expectation, but a false idea that young people's voice is only valuable for young people. Your voice is only valuable if someone's paying you for it. But anytime it's a consultation process for someone, so if someone wants us to support young people to comment on their strategy, if someone wants us to support young people commenting on their service delivery, then that's absolutely that should be a paid position. If young people are on a steering committee, a working group, an advisory group that's doing ongoing work for an organisation, then they should be paid for that.
No, certainly. Because so often they've given up maybe paid work to come and do that.
And the other bit with that, and sorry, just the other bit that's really important with that, when you're working with those groups, there's groups of young people who don't have, again, maybe that young people doing it tough, young people who don't have those experiences of employment. There's a real identity piece in being able to say, I'm a WH&R commissioner, I'm a Youth Action Steering Committee member. For many of those young people, they don't have that in their immediate community or in their immediate peer circle. So I always love that thing when young people on Facebook would change their status to say, I'm on Youth Action's Youth Help, a HALAC member. And for me, that's like, now you've got an identity as somebody who's working. And that's really important. And it's a nice transition space for young people. Again, some of these young people will go on and be, they'll be Prime Minister one day, but there's others who it's been such a journey for them, again, that they lived experiences. It's been such a journey just to get to a point where they feel valued. That being able to say I'm valued as an expert is hugely transformative for them, more than the money for them.
And starting to create their CV.
Absolutely. Massively important.
I'm going to go to the next question, which is from Dan. Great presentation. I'm wondering how we can tackle social determinants of health through policy when government departments often work as separate entities. Have you any thoughts or advice on how we could do this while ensuring young people remain at the centre of policy development?
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to be a good answer for you or not, Daniel, but I think that for me, I try to keep it simple with what are young people saying and then take what young people are saying back to government. So I don't start with what government wants. I don't start with what government thinks. I don't start with that kind of complex baggage that comes within that space. I just start with trying to start in that space of possibility about what are young people thinking about health. For us, one of the other bits I didn't mention was part of our process with that health literacy group is we actually found we were getting lots of comments and content about health policy. So we're actually putting together a health policy recommendations document, and we'll do the same process. We'll have a roundtable, we'll test that with government. But I think it's that bit. Start with young people and then kind of put government on the back foot, put them in the space where they have to kind of respond to young people rather than young people responding to government. I think it's that bit. Like the minute you have young people responding to government, you notice that, the government reps will just, nod and they do it the same with the sector. They'll nod, oh, thanks very much. Yes, we've listened to you now, and they go away. Whereas I actually think of it's like, no, you have to talk to young people about what you're doing and you have to justify and you have to be accountable to them. It forces them into that power difference. It takes them back into a kind of a more even playing field. I'm not sure if that's helpful though, Daniel, sorry, I just shortened your name.
No, I think it will be, because it is actually turning things back to front or tipping them upside down.
Yeah, and it's always simplifies things when you talk to young people, because it's always simpler when you talk to community. It's always simpler when you talk to humans. It's that language, that the government language is the thing that it's meant to confuse us. It's meant to be complicated. Government is really good at speaking to itself and they understand it, but nobody else. It's really difficult. So I just go back to actually what are the real people, real humans in this space talking about, and then how do I get that into that other arena?
Dan's just answered it's been helpful. So there you go. Another question, if I may, and it's from Helen. Amazing presentation, thank you. Is there a platform for policymakers to seek youth input through youth action?
Yeah, you just email me. We're not. Look, there is. I mean, we're a small team. We do some fee-for-service work. So sometimes government will come to us and ask for us to do a particular piece of work, and we'll do that as a fee-for-service piece, just a capacity build. Either we'll do, I mean, this actually can be non-government as well. Sometimes we build people's capacity to do this themselves if they're going to do it in a continuing way, or otherwise, particularly with government, we try to suggest, don't do it. It's not your area of expertise. We'll do it, and then we'll feed it back to you, and we'll, provide you with a report and those recommendations. But yeah, it's literally just emailing us, and if we can't help, we can usually think of someone who can.
Very useful. I've got another question here, which I'm just going to mark as a question so you get recorded. And it's from Maya.
Hi, Maya.
You mentioned it is easy to engage young people. What advice would you give to researchers and health professionals who have never engaged young people in their work?
Yeah, I would advise you to partner with someone who is expert in engaging young people. So whilst everyone was young once, has young people in their lives, may still be a young person, but is now working as a professional, maybe just outside the age of being a young person, it's a very different skill set to engage young people broadly. It's not, my lived experience as a young person or a parent is not relevant in this context. And I think that that's sometimes the bit that we have a lot, I'm sure, Maya, you get the same, because I know you're an expert in this space and you could probably answer this question better than I can. Lots of people talk, I'm a parent, I know stuff about young people. I really think they need it. And immediately people fall into that kind of personal space. So if it's not what you do, that's fine. Come to an organisation like us or the WHY or any really good organisation that does youth participation work, and have a conversation about partnering with them. And whoever will do that engagement space or capacity build, train you how to do that well. Partner with a youth organisation. There's loads of really great youth services and youth organisations who work in that youth voice and youth participation space. But yeah, I'm not a health expert. I would go to someone who worked in health to do that part for me. So the same thing, go to someone who's an expert in working with young people. Young people love opportunities to engage in these spaces. Services love opportunities to empower young people to engage in these spaces. So it's really important that you kind of create those linkages.
Really well said. I don't know how many times I've interviewed people for a job who think that being a parent will qualify them for adolescent work.
Yeah, and as soon as you say it out loud, you go, of course that's not right. But we slip into it. So hugely important. It's an area that has specialised expertise. Go to people who have it.
Now I've got another question from Pip.
Hi, Pip.
Do you ever use social media for consultation?
Yeah, I feel like you should answer this question, Pip. I would go to Pip and ask her for help with that. Look, I think it's awesome, and you should. We just don't necessarily always have the capacity to do that. So our stuff. Oh, it's a different Pip, not Pip Collin. I thought it was you. Sorry.
We'll start again.
I don't know you. Philippa Collins, the person you should speak to about using social media for consultations. Yes, I think it's good. I know lots of people do it. It's purely a capacity thing for us. We were flat out just trying to get our heads around doing this stuff online with young people. And I was saying to Kate earlier that surprisingly, young people respond really well to doing the kinds of consultations that we do online. I started during the pandemic, so everything I did up until probably when I went to Munro the other week, all of my stuff at Youth Action was online. And some of that was definitely with groups of young people who were excluded from policy conversations. So I find getting young people to communicate online much better than getting a group of adults to communicate online. We do a lot of work with the sector. I find it much harder to draw out interactive stuff with the sector than I do with young people. But yeah, ask Pip Collin about social media, because I know that certainly the WHY do a lot of work in that space around using digital technologies with young people. And there's some fantastic examples.
I think perhaps we might wrap up with a comment, although you might like to comment on a comment from Pip Collin, saying, thank you, Kate, for highlighting that working with young people to develop the questions that drive our research, policy and service improvement reframes the challenges and can help us understand target change more effectively. So I don't think that was a question, but I think it's a really excellent point for me to finish on, because we've hit the 2 o'clock mark. And I just would, on behalf of everyone online, to thank Kate for being with us for an hour and really getting us thinking about some important issues around engagement of youth and advocating for youth. So thank you, Kate, very much.
No worries, thank you, and feel free to reach out. Anyway, someone will have my email. My email is on our website, so feel free to reach out.
Okay, thank you so much. And that's the end of our webinar for today. Bye.